The wind sweeping across Lewistown felt sharper than usual that morning, cutting through Olivia Whitmore's coat as she stood beside her husband's coffin. Ernest had always imagined a full church if he ever passed, a room filled with co-workers from the garage, old friends from the community, neighbors who knew him for decades. But the funeral that unfolded before her was nothing like that. It was small, painfully quiet, and strangely empty. Only Martha Jenkins stood near her, offering silent support, along with a few elderly neighbors who shuffled in with sympathy that felt thin and uncertain. Behind her, Olivia could hear her sons. Andrew stood stiffly in a tailored jacket that didn't belong in a town this humble, checking his watch every few minutes. Ian stood beside him, shifting his weight, whispering under his breath. Their voices were low, but not low enough to hide the impatience woven into every word. She heard fragments, paperwork, timelines, "we need to keep this moving," phrases that felt cold at a funeral, colder still at her husband's. Olivia tried to steady her breathing as the pastor continued the brief service. She focused on the cadence of his voice, anything to anchor herself in a moment that felt unreal. Ernest was gone. Her Ernest, the man who fixed bicycles for neighborhood kids for free, the man who rebuilt their porch with his bare hands, the man who laughed loudly and hugged gently. The absence of all of that sat heavy on her chest. Then her phone buzzed. The sound was so sharp, so out of place in the hushed cemetery that she flinched. She hesitated before slipping her hand into her handbag. It felt wrong to check a phone during a funeral, but some instinct told her to look. A text from an unknown number lit up her screen. "I've alive. That isn't me in the coffin." Olivia's breath caught. Her pulse kicked hard against her ribs. She blinked, certain she had misread it, but the words remained, stark and unforgiving in the cold morning light. Another message appeared seconds later. "Don't trust our sons." Her fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles paled. She slowly lifted her gaze toward Andrew and Ian. Their expressions had not changed. No panic, no confusion, no sign they were aware of the messages displayed on her screen. They stood rigid and composed, as if attending a meeting instead of burying their father. Olivia swallowed hard. She didn't believe what she was reading, couldn't believe it, but something deep inside her responded before logic could. A flicker of fear, a prickling sense that a door she had never wanted to open had just cracked. The pastor finished speaking. The service ended with an abruptness that felt almost disrespectful. Before Olivia could gather herself, Andrew stepped forward, clapping his hands together softly as though concluding a business task. "We'll handle everything from here," he said, already motioning to the funeral director. "Mom, don't worry about the details. It's all under control." Under control. The words echoed in her mind, heavy and unsettling. She nodded numbly, unable to voice the unease crawling beneath her skin. Something was wrong, not in a vague, distant way, but in a visceral, bone-deep way she couldn't yet articulate. When the small crowd dispersed, Olivia turned toward home. The Pennsylvania wind whipped through the trees, carrying the smell of cold earth and fallen leaves. She held her phone close to her chest, gripping it as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. And as she walked through the quiet streets of Lewistown, the words on the screen followed her with every step, chilling her deeper than the November air ever could. Long before the funeral, long before the text messages that cracked her world open, Olivia's life with Ernest had been defined by simplicity. They had built their years together in a rhythm that felt steady and honest. Morning coffee in their narrow kitchen, Ernest heading out to his old garage shop at the edge of Lewistown, Olivia tending to the laundry or the small vegetable patch behind the house. Their life wasn't lavish, but it was theirs, held together by decades of routine and quiet affection. The garage had always been Ernest's pride, a modest workshop with peeling paint and a hand-carved sign he'd made in his 20s. It had served generation after generation of locals. He repaired lawnmowers, fixed bicycles for kids, patched up old engines, and refused to overcharge anyone, even when customers insisted. Ernest saw his work as service, not business. Olivia used to tease him, calling him the most generous mechanic in Pennsylvania, and he'd just smile, wiping grease from his hands like a badge of honor. Their sons had grown up in that world. Messy, humble, grounded. Andrew and Ian had spent summers sweeping the workshop floor, handing Ernest tools, laughing at his stories about stubborn engines and even more stubborn customers. Back then, the boys were warm, curious, and inseparable from their parents. But that was another lifetime. Things began to shift when Andrew landed a job in Harrisburg. The real estate market there was booming, and he was hungry for success. Ian followed soon after, encouraged by his older brother's enthusiasm and the promise of quick money. The distance between Lewistown and Harrisburg wasn't far on a map, but emotionally it became a widening gulf. The phone calls that once came weekly grew shorter, then sporadic. Holidays turned from joyful reunions into carefully timed appointments squeezed between open houses and weekend clients. Their voices carried a new tone, hurried, calculating, distracted. Conversations about childhood memories and town gossip were replaced by discussions of interest rates, property values, and investment strategies. Olivia tried not to take it personally. She reminded herself that children grow up, lives move forward, priorities shift. Ernest, however, sensed something deeper. "They're different," he had said more than once while they washed dishes together after a quiet dinner. "They talk like they're too old for us, or like we're holding them back." He'd tried. He truly had. Ernest would call them, offer to help with home repairs, invite them to barbecues, ask about their work. But the boys spoke to him in clipped tones, as if he were an outdated appliance. Useful once, but now obsolete. The first real argument had erupted the year Andrew suggested they sell the family home. He presented the idea like a financial strategy. "You could downsize," he said, "or move to assisted living where things would be easier. You don't need all this space." Olivia remembered the way Ernest's jaw had tightened. "This house is our life," he'd said quietly. "Your mother raised you here. We built everything here." But the boys only saw dollar signs. They talked about market trends, maintenance costs, energy efficiency, everything except the fact that the home held their childhood inside its walls. Ian had echoed Andrew's reasoning, adding, "We're just thinking about what's best for you." But the words didn't land as concern. They landed like pressure. From that moment, something fragile began to unravel. The warmth that once defined the Whitmore family cooled into formality. Visits felt rehearsed. Conversations felt manufactured. Every suggestion the boys made sounded less like care and more like management. Olivia didn't know when exactly she and Ernest had lost their sons. But in those quiet years before the tragedy, she felt the distance grow inch by inch. And now, standing on the other side of Ernest's death, every memory of that slow drift returned with a sting she could no longer ignore. The call came on a cold weekday afternoon, slicing through Olivia's quiet kitchen like a blade. A nurse from Geisinger Lewistown Hospital informed her that Ernest had been brought in after what was described as a workshop explosion. The words didn't make sense at first. Ernest was careful to a fault. He never mishandled equipment, never left chemicals uncapped, never took risks with machinery. Still, Olivia grabbed her coat and keys and rushed out the door, her heart thudding against her ribs. When she arrived at the hospital, the bright fluorescent lights and sharp disinfectant smell made her head spin. A doctor approached her with a tight expression, guiding her toward the critical care unit. Ernest lay unconscious, surrounded by monitors that beeped in erratic intervals. Tubes and wires covered his body in a way that made him almost unrecognizable. Olivia pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "What happened?" she whispered. The doctor hesitated. "He was found collapsed in his workshop. But his injuries aren't consistent with a blast. No external burns. No shrapnel. No head trauma. We're still running tests." Before Olivia could process the inconsistency, Andrew and Jessica appeared at the end of the hallway, far quicker than she expected. Ian followed moments later, slightly out of breath. Their arrival was so fast it felt rehearsed. And instead of asking how Ernest was, they immediately cornered a nurse, peppering her with questions about insurance coverage, next of kin authority, and the projected cost of keeping Ernest in the ICU. Olivia stared at them, surprised. "Your father is lying in there," she murmured, voice shaking. "Please, just give me a moment with him." They barely acknowledged her, absorbed in administrative questions. When Olivia finally reached Ernest's bedside, she took his hand, still warm, still familiar. For a moment, she thought he was completely unresponsive. Then, faintly, his fingers tightened around hers. It was brief, barely there, but unmistakable. A squeeze, a signal, a plea. "Ernest," she whispered, leaning closer. "I'm here. I'm right here." But the moment passed. His hand fell slack again. Olivia felt a chill move through her, deep and instinctive. Something was wrong. Wrong with the story she'd been told. Wrong with the way her sons behaved. Wrong in ways she couldn't yet understand. Doctors came and went with updates that never quite answered her questions. They spoke vaguely about organ stress, metabolic complications, abnormal toxicology markers, things that didn't align with a simple explosion. Each answer opened another unsettling door. Within days, the machines hummed softer. Ernest's body weakened, and on a gray morning where the sun never fully broke through the clouds, he slipped away. Olivia stood by his bedside as the monitors went flat, feeling a grief so sharp she could barely breathe. She thought she would have a moment to process the loss. She didn't. Andrew immediately stepped in, as though waiting for this exact moment. "We should do cremation," he announced, scrolling through his phone. "There's a package that's straightforward. Quick. Clean. Mom, you don't need the stress." Jessica echoed him with forced gentleness. "It's better for you, Olivia. You shouldn't handle logistics right now." Ian stood behind them, nodding silently like a shadow. Olivia, drained and numb, couldn't muster the strength to argue. She simply nodded, letting their words wash over her like static. But even in her dazed state, she felt an itch beneath her grief, an unease growing heavier by the minute. The story of the accident didn't fit. The boy's urgency didn't fit. Nothing fit. And as she followed her children out of the hospital, Olivia knew the fracture in her world was widening, even if she couldn't yet see what waited on the other side. The morning after Ernest's death, Olivia sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, staring at a cup of untouched coffee. The house felt too quiet, too hollow. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to focus on anything other than the ache in her chest. That was when her phone buzzed again. A new text from the same unknown number. "Check the accounts." Olivia's heart lurched. For a moment, she simply stared at the message, unsure whether to ignore it or obey. But instinct, raw and insistent, pushed her to move. She grabbed her coat, stepped outside into the sharp Pennsylvania air, and drove to the local credit union where she and Ernest had banked for decades. Inside, the familiar teller greeted her warmly, but with a hint of pity. News of Ernest's death had already reached everyone in Lewistown. Olivia asked to review recent activity on their joint accounts. After a few keystrokes, the teller's expression shifted into something uneasy. Several large withdrawals had been made under Ernest's name in the past 2 months. Not one or two, several. Each thousands of dollars. The teller printed the forms, and Olivia immediately noticed the signatures. They were uneven, shaky. each stroke trembling as if written by a man barely able to hold a pen. But Ernest's handwriting had always been steady. Even at 70, his hands were strong, his letters neat. These signatures weren't his, or rather, they didn't look like his anymore. The teller hesitated before speaking. Your son, Andrew, came in with him a few times. Said Ernest needed help reading the forms. Olivia felt her pulse hammer in her ears. She thanked the teller, collected the documents, and left before her knees gave out. As she sat in her car, another thought hit her with a cold, sharp edge. Ernest was frugal. He hated unnecessary expenses, yet the withdrawals were large and frequent. Something was deeply wrong. She drove next to the insurance office where Ernest had once purchased a small policy decades ago. The agent recognized her immediately and expressed condolences before pulling up Ernest's file. 2 new policies appeared on the screen, both purchased recently, both naming Andrew and Ian as beneficiaries. The combined total reached into several $100,000. Policies Ernest had never discussed, never hinted at, never would have taken out without talking to her. The room tilted slightly. Olivia steadied herself on the counter. Ernest hadn't been planning for the future. Someone else had been planning around him. Her phone vibrated again. Go to the garage. The words felt like a command from a ghost, but she drove there anyway. The old workshop greeted her with an eerie stillness. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of oil and metal she had known for decades was there, but everything else was wrong. The place was spotless, too spotless. Tools hung in perfect lines. The concrete floor showed no scorch marks, no stains, no signs of fire or blast damage. There was no debris, no ruptured equipment, no broken shelving. No explosion had happened here, not even close. Her breath faltered. She moved slowly toward Ernest's workbench, the heart of the garage. One drawer stuck slightly as she tried to open it. When she pulled harder, it gave way with a squeak. Inside lay a small, worn notebook, Ernest's handwriting covering the first few pages. Olivia opened it with trembling fingers. The entries were fragmented, hurried, distressed. Andrew says the new insurance is just a precaution. Doesn't feel right. The boys keep talking about their debts, pressuring me to sign forms. Something is being planned. Need to protect Olivia. The words blurred as tears stung her eyes. Every line, every shaky sentence, revealed a husband who had sensed something terrible closing in on him. And now Olivia knew for certain. The story of the accident was a lie someone desperately wanted her to believe. In the days following Ernest's death, Olivia tried to retreat into routine. Laundry, slow walks, quiet mornings, but grief clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. She barely had time to settle into her loss before Andrew and Jessica began appearing at the house with alarming frequency. Their visits weren't framed as comfort or support, or even shared mourning. They came with clipboards, envelopes, folders, everything except compassion. Andrew was the first to introduce the topic, lowering his voice as though discussing something practical and necessary. "Mom, we really need you to sign a few documents," he said one afternoon, spreading papers across her kitchen table. "It's just a power of attorney. Nothing dramatic. It'll help us manage things for you." Jessica chimed in with a soft smile that never touched her eyes. "It's what families do, Olivia. You shouldn't have to worry about handling everything alone." Olivia stared at the dense text on the forms. Unfamiliar legal terms and sweeping authorizations that would hand complete control of her finances and decisions to her sons. Her stomach tightened. "I don't think I need this," she murmured. "Your father and I always managed on our own." Andrew's jaw clenched for a moment before he plastered on another smile. "Mom, this isn't about the past. It's about what makes sense now." Ian arrived later that week, carrying a binder full of brochures that he placed on the coffee table with forced gentleness. I visited some assisted living places near Harrisburg, he said, flipping through glossy photos of smiling retirees. They're incredible. You'd be more comfortable there. You won't have to maintain the house or worry about being alone. Olivia felt her throat tighten. This is my home, she said quietly. I'm not ready for anything like that. Ian sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We're just thinking about your needs. That's all. But Olivia heard something else beneath his tone. Urgency, frustration, calculation. Jessica returned the next day with fresh brochures, speaking in a syrupy, patronizing voice that made Olivia's skin prickle. You deserve a place where people can take care of you, she insisted. This house is too big, too old, too much for you. It was the exact echo of arguments Ernest had once dreaded. As the conversation stretched, Olivia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped away from her children long enough to check it. A new anonymous text appeared on her screen. Don't drink anything from them. Her breath caught. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her hand trembling. Terrified, she replayed every moment from the past week. Every cup of tea Jessica had offered. Every glass of water Ian had poured. A cold dread settled into her bones. Her own children no longer felt safe. Over the next few days, conversations grew sharper. Andrew insisted the house needed to be sold soon. It's a good market, he said. You could get a solid price, and we could reinvest it for your future. Jessica repeated the phrase, your future, so often it began to sound like a threat. Ian remained quieter, but followed Andrew's lead, nodding along with every suggestion, every push. To Olivia, it felt like her sons were reading from a script, one she had never seen but was clearly expected to obey. The more they insisted, the clearer it became. They were accelerating something behind the scenes, something she did not yet understand, something she feared she was running out of time to uncover. And in her own kitchen, surrounded by her children's eager, determined faces, Olivia felt the chilling truth settle over her. She was no longer sure whether they wanted to help her or remove her. The next morning, Olivia woke with a single thought pressing against her ribs. She needed answers. Real answers. Not the ones her sons fed her. Not the ones wrapped in formal condolences and rushed funeral plans. Ernest's notebook had cracked something open inside her, something sharp and unignorable. She drove to the Mifflin County Sheriff's Office, the old stone building standing firm against the cold wind. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the heavy door. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and worn carpet. A deputy at the reception desk asked if she needed help. Olivia cleared her throat. I'd like to see the accident report for my husband's workshop explosion. The deputy blinked. Explosion. Before she could explain further, a tall man in a gray suit approached. Detective Raymond Holt, badges clipped neatly to his belt, extended a hand. His expression was professional but not unkind. Ma'am, I overheard. Let's talk in my office. Inside, Holt motioned for her to sit. Tell me exactly what happened. Olivia explained the call she received the day of the incident. How Ernest had been taken to Geisinger Lewistown Hospital after what her sons described as a workshop explosion. She kept her voice steady, but her fingers twisted together in her lap. When she finished, Holt leaned back, brow furrowed. Mrs. Collins, he said carefully, there were no explosion reports in Mifflin County for the past 3 months. Not at a workshop, not at a business, not at any private property. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Olivia blinked hard, gripping the arms of her chair. That can't be right, she whispered. That's what my sons told me. That's how Ernest ended up in the ICU. Holt opened a database on his computer and turned the screen slightly toward her. Every fire, every burn-related incident, every hazardous material call, we logged them all. Nothing came in. Nothing matches what you're describing. A chill spread through her chest. She swallowed. Then what happened to my husband? Holt paused. Would you like me to request his medical records? As next of kin, you're entitled to at least the coroner's summary. Olivia nodded, her voice barely audible. The detective placed a call, speaking with clinical precision. After several minutes, he printed a document that slid from the machine with a soft hum. He carried it back to her, his eyes shadowed with concern. This is the preliminary coroner's report. Olivia accepted the pages with shaking fingers. She scanned the lines until the words seemed to leap out at her. Cause of death, methanol poisoning. Findings, high concentration in blood. No evidence of blast injury or thermal trauma. Manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. Poisoning, she breathed. But they said he was burned. He wasn't, Holt said quietly. There are no burn injuries listed. No fractures. No signs consistent with an explosion. Olivia's hands tightened on the paper. My sons told the hospital he was burned. They insisted on cremation. They said it was best for me not to see him. Holt's eyes sharpened. According to the file, your sons requested limited disclosure due to emotional distress. Hospitals sometimes accommodate phrasing like that, but toxicology results are not hidden by a family request. They're part of the official record. Olivia's breath caught. Everything inside her cracked open. Fear, confusion, betrayal. Grief twisting into something darker and colder. Her husband had been murdered, and the people who insisted they were protecting her had been hiding the truth. She looked up at Holt, her voice trembling but steady. What do I do now? If you can provide any additional evidence, bank irregularities, insurance paperwork, anything that shows intent, I can open a criminal investigation, Holt said. But I need something solid to move forward. Olivia nodded slowly, clutching the coroner's report to her chest like proof of a nightmare she could no longer deny. When she stepped outside, the Pennsylvania wind cut across her face, but she hardly felt it. She stood on the courthouse steps, staring down at the trembling papers in her hands. Honest hadn't died in an accident. He hadn't died in confusion. He had been silenced. And now she understood why the text messages had warned her. Why her sons were pushing so hard. Why everything felt like it was closing in. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a blade. The sun was already low when Olivia returned home from the sheriff's office, the coroner's report still clutched in her shaking hands. She sat in Ernest's old armchair, the house silent except for the ticking of a wall clock he'd repaired years ago. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't know who to trust. Her phone buzzed. A single message lit the screen. I'm coming over. Don't be afraid. Before she could respond, 3 slow knocks sounded at the front door. Olivia froze. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she approached the entrance and opened it just enough to see a tall, broad-shouldered man standing on her porch. His hair was graying, his jacket worn but clean, and his expression held sadness she recognized instantly. Mrs. Collins, he asked gently. It's Stu McAllister. The name caught her off guard. Ernest had mentioned him a handful of times over the years, a former deputy sheriff, an old hunting buddy, someone he trusted. Olivia stepped aside. Come in. Stu entered, quietly, removing his hat with respect. He stood for a moment, taking in the living room as if it held ghosts only he could see. I've been trying to protect you the only way I could, he said. But now that Detective Holt is involved, you deserve to know everything. Olivia's breath trembled. Were you the one texting me? Yes. He nodded. I didn't want to frighten you, but Ernest made me promise. He came to me weeks before all this. Stu's jaw tightened. He wasn't a paranoid man. You know that. But he told me he felt something closing in on him. Olivia sank into the chair opposite him. Tell me. Stu set a small flash drive on the coffee table. Ernest recorded a few conversations. He didn't want to believe his own sons were capable of wrongdoing, but he wanted proof before confronting them. He plugged the drive into Olivia's laptop and clicked play on the first audio file. Andrew's voice filled the room. Sharp, impatient, angry. "I'm not signing another loan extension, Ian. I need real money. Insurance pays out faster than waiting for Dad to sell anything." Olivia pressed a hand to her mouth. The next recording was worse. Ernest's voice was faint, uneasy, followed by Andrew's tight whisper. "Just sign it, Dad. It's for everyone's benefit. Stop making this so difficult." Then Ian, "If Dad won't sign voluntarily, we can create symptoms. A little spike in his drink. People his age get confused all the time." Olivia's vision blurred. Her whole body shook. Another clip. "Industrial-grade stuff works fast," Andrew muttered. Ian replied, "Not too much. We don't want questions." Stu paused the playback as Olivia doubled over, sobbing. "They hurt him," she whispered. "My boys. Hurt their own father." Stu's voice was steady but filled with sorrow. Ernest knew they were pressuring him with the insurance policies. He knew they were drowning in debt. He didn't want you to suffer for their mistakes. Stu reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were photos, surveillance shots of Andrew standing outside a supply warehouse near Harrisburg, loading a canister marked methanol into his car. "I took these myself," Stu said quietly, "after Ernest asked me to look into what they'd been up to." Olivia's hands trembled violently as she flipped through the images. Each one hit harder than the last. "And there's more," Stu added. He reached into his pocket again and held out a folded piece of paper. He wrote this the day before he died. In Ernest's familiar handwriting were the words, "If anything happens to me, Stu, watch out for Olivia. Protect her. She doesn't know the danger she's in." Olivia's breath collapsed into a broken sob. Her sons hadn't just betrayed their father. They had planned, prepared, and executed the path that led to his death. And if Ernest was right, they weren't finished. Stu placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Olivia, but you need to act. Ernest trusted me to help you, and I won't break that promise." Olivia sat there, devastated, the weight of the truth settling into her bones. Heartbreak and horror mingled inside her, because the people she had loved the most were the ones who had destroyed everything. Olivia didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dining table with Stu beside her, the flash drive, photographs, bank records, insurance documents, and Ernest's notebook spread out like the pieces of a nightmare she could no longer deny. Just after sunrise, they walked into the Mifflin County Sheriff's office, carrying every scrap of evidence they had. Detective Raymond Holt met them in the hallway, immediately sensing the gravity of what they had brought. "We have enough?" Olivia asked, her voice thin but steady. Holt looked through the material, piece by piece, listening to the recordings, reviewing the forged signatures, examining the methanol purchase photos. By the time he finished, his expression had shifted from concern to grim resolve. "I'm taking this to the district attorney's office right now," he said. "If ADA Carter signs off, we'll proceed before dawn tomorrow." True to his word, Holt drove straight to the county building. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Carter, sharp-eyed and unflinching, reviewed the evidence in silence. The audio recordings alone made her lips tighten. "Prepare arrest warrants," she said. "Both sons, and MS. Delgado Alvarez as a material witness." Holt called Olivia an hour later. "Stay home tonight," he instructed. "We'll take it from here." Before the sun rose the next morning, the operation was already in motion. Cold Pennsylvania air hung over the quiet streets as deputies gathered outside two separate houses, Andrew's in Harrisburg and Ian's smaller place farther east. At Andrew's house, officers approached silently, positioning themselves along the porch and side windows. When Holt gave the signal, They pounded on the door. Mifflin County Sheriff's Office. Andrew Collins, open the door! Andrew stumbled into view, disheveled and irritated. What the hell is this? It's 5 a.m. You're under arrest for the murder of Ernest Collins, Holt declared. Step outside with your hands visible. Andrew scoffed. But when Holt played just 10 seconds of the recorded conversation, the line where Andrew said industrial-grade stuff works fast, his face drained of color. That's taken out of context, he stammered, but his voice cracked. I didn't mean. His bravado collapsed as cuffs tightened around his wrists. Across town, Ian reacted very differently. When deputies knocked on his sliding door, he bolted before they even finished announcing themselves. He sprinted through the backyard, slipping on frost-covered grass, vaulting over a small fence before stumbling into a neighbor's property. Stop! Sheriff's office. Ian tried to run faster, but panic made him clumsy. Within minutes, 2 deputies tackled him near a row of trash bins. He hit the ground hard, breathless and trembling. I didn't touch him, he cried. Andrew pushed everything. It wasn't me. But the recordings said otherwise. Jessica woke to deputies entering the home she shared with Andrew. She clung to a blanket, tears streaming down her face, insisting over and over that she knew nothing. I thought the insurance forms were normal, she sobbed. Andrew told me it was the responsible thing to do. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know. But Holt's questions quickly revealed inconsistencies about her presence during the bank withdrawals, about conversations she had overheard, about the assisted living brochures she'd brought to Olivia. She dissolved into frantic crying as deputies escorted her out as a material witness. By mid-morning, news of the arrests had spread through Lewistown, in a town where everyone knew everyone. The story traveled like wildfire. At the diner where Ernest once stopped for morning coffee, patrons sat in stunned silence. At the local hardware store, workers whispered behind counters, shaking their heads. No one could believe that Ernest's own sons, boys he'd raised, coached, and supported, were capable of what the evidence showed. Olivia stayed inside her house that day, curtains drawn, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't vengeful. She was grieving for Ernest, for the truth, and for the sons she no longer recognized. But for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a single, fragile thread of something like safety return to her chest. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in the Mifflin County Courthouse, the kind of day when the sky hung low and gray over Lewistown, even before Olivia arrived. The hallways were crowded. Neighbors she had known for decades, customers who had once brought broken engines to Ernest's garage, parents whose children Ernest had helped fix bicycles for. All of them filled the benches. Local reporters crowded the entryway, cameras barred from the courtroom, but notebooks ready. Olivia walked in slowly, Stu beside her. She felt every gaze settle on her, not with judgment, but with sorrow, with sympathy, with the quiet shock of a town still struggling to understand how this tragedy had unfolded. When the jury was seated, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Carter rose. Her voice was steady, crisp, carrying the weight of what the state intended to prove. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed. It is about manipulation. It is about the deliberate and calculated murder of Ernest Collins, carried out by his own sons. She outlined the charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and elder financial exploitation. Each count landed like a stone in the silent room. Carter then projected enlarged versions of the coroner's toxicology findings. 2 toxicologists took the stand, explaining in unflinching detail how methanol metabolizes into formaldehyde, how it shuts down the optic nerves, how it ultimately poisons the body. There were no burn marks on Mr. Collins, one testified, no blast injuries. These are not the injuries of a man involved in an explosion. These are the injuries of a man who ingested methanol. An OSHA expert followed, confirming that Ernest's workshop showed no trace whatsoever of an explosion. No scorch patterns, no damaged wiring, no structural impact, nothing. The gallery murmured. Andrew, sitting beside his attorney, stared angrily at the table. Ian kept his head down, hands shaking. Then Stu McAllister was called. He approached the witness stand with the slow, measured steps of someone carrying the last promise of a dead friend. He introduced himself, explained his former role as a deputy sheriff, and then recounted Ernest's fear, the conversations they'd had, the suspicions that had grown in the final weeks. When Carter asked him to play the recordings, he nodded once and pressed a button. Andrew's voice echoed through the courtroom. Industrial-grade stuff works fast. Ian's voice followed. If Dad won't sign voluntarily, we can create symptoms. No one breathed. Even the judge's expression shifted, grief mixing with disbelief. Stu continued, describing the photos he had taken of Andrew buying industrial methanol outside Harrisburg. He explained Ernest's handwritten note, the request to watch over Olivia if anything happened. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the entire courtroom felt altered, frayed, crushed under the weight of what he had revealed. Then it was Olivia's turn. She walked slowly to the stand, spine straight, hands clasped to stop their trembling. When she began speaking, her voice was soft but unwavering. She told the jury about Ernest's final days, about the supposed accident, about the pressure her sons had applied to both of them, about the documents, the withdrawals, the fear that had crept into her home. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the truth. And in its honesty, the testimony was devastating. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom sat frozen. Andrew Collins, guilty on all charges. Sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Ian Collins, guilty of conspiracy and negligent homicide. Sentence: 25 years in state prison with a mandated psychiatric evaluation. Jessica, though not charged, was cited as a material witness. Her involvement would remain under civil review for months to come. As the deputies led Andrew and Ian away, Olivia didn't watch them. She stared at her hands in her lap, feeling the ache of something deeper than relief. She mourned Ernest, the husband taken from her, and she mourned the sons she had already lost long before any verdict was read. In the months after the trial, the Collins home settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the hollow silence that had followed Ernest's death, nor the tense stillness that had filled its rooms when Andrew and Ian prowled around with paperwork and false concern. This was a gentler quiet, a healing one. Olivia moved carefully through her days, restoring the house piece by piece. She repainted the kitchen, the soft sage color Ernest had always said made the room feel like spring. She opened windows that hadn't been raised in years, letting the Pennsylvania breezes sweep through the halls. But the biggest change was the workshop. Ernest's old garage had once been a place of warmth, of tinkering, of radio music and half-finished projects. It had also become the center of a lie, the fabricated explosion her sons used to cover their tracks. Olivia couldn't let it remain frozen in that shadow. With Stu's help and Martha's gardening expertise, she cleared the space. They tore down rusted shelving, removed the workbench, and opened the back wall to the small patch of land behind the house. Over several weekends, they built a quiet memorial garden, a stone path, a simple wooden bench, clusters of lavender and white peonies. In the center, beneath an old oak tree, Olivia placed a brass plaque engraved with a single line, in loving memory of Ernest Whitmore, steady hands, steady heart. Every morning, she visited the garden with a cup of tea, and every morning, the world felt a little less broken. The financial shock of the past year had left Olivia wary of money, yet determined to use what remained with purpose. Ironically, the insurance payout, funds her sons had once seen as salvation, had become hers to control after the court froze and redistributed their fraudulent claims. One afternoon, sitting with paperwork spread across her dining table, Olivia made a decision that felt like both justice and healing. She established the Ernest Whitmore Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to supporting older adults who had experienced financial abuse from family members. Ernest would have wanted this, Martha said, signing on as a volunteer coordinator. Stu agreed without hesitation, offering to help run safety workshops and speak to local churches and community groups. Word spread throughout Lewistown, and soon people began coming to Olivia quietly, women and men who had been pressured, manipulated, or stolen from by their own relatives. Olivia listened to every story, offering resources, guidance, or simply the dignity of being heard. Helping them steadied her. Helping them brought Ernest closer. Seasons changed. Spring warmed into summer, then softened into fall. Olivia found a rhythm. The garden in the mornings, foundation work in the afternoons. Simple dinners with Martha or quiet conversations with Stu as dusk folded over the town. Then, in early October, a letter arrived from the Department of Corrections. Andrew had taken his own life in prison. Ian had been transferred to a long-term psychiatric wing after breakdown. Olivia sat at her kitchen table, hands resting on the folded letter. She felt the ache, but not shock, not anger, not bitterness either. Just a quiet, tired sorrow for what her sons had become, for the choices they had made long before any crime was committed. She did not attend services for Andrew. She did not visit Ian. She simply let the news settle and pass, like a storm she had already survived. One evening at dusk, she carried a bouquet of fresh flowers to Ernest's memorial garden. Fireflies flickered across the yard as the sky darkened into shades of violet and gold. She sat on the wooden bench and laid the flowers beneath the oak tree. "Ernest," she whispered, "I helped 3 people this week. A widow from Port Royal, a farmer whose son took everything, a retired teacher who didn't know where to turn." The wind rustled through the branches above her, gentle and soft. "I think you'd be proud," she said. In the fading light, surrounded by the quiet strength of the garden, Olivia felt something close to peace, not triumphant, not loud, but deep and dignified, a quiet victory written not in revenge, but in the life she chose to rebuild.